This is House Planning Help, episode 19.
Have you always wanted to build your dream home? Maybe you know what you want. But what if it could be better? HousePlanningHelp.com. Speaking to the experts, searching for better ways, planning for the future. Build a better home. HousePlanningHelp.com podcast.
Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and coming up today, I chat to the author of the House Builder's Bible, that's Mark Brinkley.
HousePlanningHelp.com.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here again. In the last episode, if you heard that one that I did at EcoBuild, when I put it together afterwards, I was suffering from the flu. I don't think I've ever had the flu before, and it really got to me because I wanted to keep on going, keep doing everything for the blog, but yes, it knocked me for 6. So hopefully that episode made some sense. We're on to another one now, and before we dive into the key content, a great interview coming with Mark Brinkley, I wanted to say a quick hi to Lloyd Brown, who's emailed in, and it's a long email. I love the fact that you've taken the time to do this, but I just wanted to say hi to you in the US, and you say that you've got a bit more experience, been learning about all this kind of stuff for 20 odd years, which is very good, but you're still enjoying hearing about the various approaches, the good points and the bad points of those approaches too. And you've given me some great feedback, some ideas for podcasts. That one where we touched on mass and glass versus light and tight. You'd like me to go into more detail on that. We'll have a dig around for a guest who might be able to help me on that. And another idea that you have about using computer software to simulate various scenarios of design, which I think is fantastic. I don't quite have the resources yet, but when we do, we will be doing it. We want to keep this thing motoring in the right direction. But one thing you did mention is that you've tried to listen back to all the past episodes, but you can only go so far. And I know this is a problem with iTunes because I'm sure it's something they've only done recently. And it means that you can check out the back catalogue, the last 10 episodes, but can't go beyond that. Well, you can, but I think you need to subscribe first, and then you need to have a dig around in there. It's not as simple as you'd expect it to be, but if you get to the right bit, you can download them all manually. So if you haven't heard the early episodes and you're intrigued and you'd like to, it is possible. That's all I'm saying at the moment. Let's move into the main content for this episode. It's a great conversation.
HousePlanningHelp.com. The interview.
I'm with Mark Brinkley, author of The House Builder's Bible, but today we've got quite an interesting topic that we want to talk about, looking at the UK system and the German system and comparing and contrasting the two and seeing what we can take from that. But let's say hello to Mark. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Ben.
And maybe we could start by just getting a bit of background on your career and how you came to write The House Builder's Bible.
Well, it's a long time now. I've been involved in construction for since 1980, so that's well over 30 years. The first half of that was as a builder, starting as a sort of site carpenter and then gradually moving into being a developer of barns and new builds. And then more latterly, since the 90s, I've been writing about the process. I started a book called The House Builder's Bible, started writing it in the early 90s, not too sure what the reception would be, but it's gone on to sell very well, and every 2 years I update it and bring out a new edition. And I'm about to launch the 10th edition, which will be on sale later in 2013.
How have things changed? You mentioned that every 2 years you update it. What do you need to update?
It's very interesting. When I first started the project, I looked around for a major publisher, and I thought they might be interested in a book on self-build. At that time, this is pre-Grand Designs. It still was a bit fringe. It wasn't quite as aspirational and well-known as it is now. And the two publishers I approached both said the same thing. You're going to put prices in it. It'll date immediately. We don't want anything to do with it. And in fact, they're quite wrong. The price is the one thing that hasn't changed enormously. In fact, what has changed, it tends to be two things, the regulations and the background planning and the fashions. The regulations come on every year incrementally. We get more codes and changes in the building regulations, and the planning changes, and there's more taxes. It gets more and more complicated to navigate one's way through it. And the fashions have changed enormously. It was a very simple business building a house in the 80s and 90s. You either went timber frame or you went brick and block, and the choices you had to make were pretty straightforward. And we've seen this huge development, partly driven by the sort of self-build industry. Of almost every aspect of it now, you're faced with a whole panoply of choices and difficult things to navigate. And much of it comes down to things like windows. You know, we used to stick Bolton and Paul windows in every house, and it was occasionally who went to Bolton and Paul, who went to Magnet. Now, there are dozens of people out there from all kinds of countries and windows performing to different standards, and it's much more complicated to navigate one's way through the maze. So the book itself has got bigger and bigger and bigger, unfortunately, and my understanding of it's gone from being hands-on, having done everything in the book, to being much more like a journalist who sort of sits there and watches the stuff coming in and tries to make sense of it like everybody else. And I'm lucky if I'm staying one step ahead of the game, but it's a struggle because it's much, much more complicated now.
What does that mean then for the self-builder? If you can't grasp it, or well, not that you can't grasp it, but if it's taking you a lot of time to get your head around it.
Well, the self-builder essentially wants to sort of work out what's the best way to build a house. What should I be doing? And I gather you're going through this process yourself, you know, asking all these questions and asking all these people. It can get very, very confusing very quickly because you can get completely snowed down with information. And what you think is a great idea one week, the next week someone comes along and trashes it and you're suddenly back to square one. I don't envy self-builders because it really is very difficult. What happens, you know, the average self-builder comes into the business knowing nothing. They're a complete rookie at it. And yet they tend to be well-educated and well-motivated. They're huge thirst for knowledge, and they pick up stuff that typical guys who've been involved in the building trade for 20, 30 years just close their mind to. You know, they've got their way of doing it. They do it this way. They've always done it. Why would they want to bother anything new? So it's like a clash of cultures. And the trouble with the self-builders, they're open to new ideas. They'll try lots of things. They're like a sponge, you know, they'll come in. But they're also out there going to make mistakes, and they'll take on ideas that they think look good on paper and turn out to be really difficult in practice. And our job as sort of guides, if you like, is to try and help get through this jungle. I call it the construction jungle. But it's not easy, and I'm not actually sometimes clear that I'm any good at all. Sometimes I feel I'm just guiding people around in even more circles, and sometimes people get hold of my book and they think, I never knew that before. Oh, that's interesting. It really opened my eye to that. And I think, you know, where I'm hoping to bring simplicity, I'm actually maybe adding extra layers of complexity. That's the paradox I'm dealing with.
I suppose then that what we're doing is we end up building something at that specific time. It's the best we can do. We've made the decisions. It's to do with building up that knowledge, and then at some point you have to go. And as I can see now, I know from a lot of these podcast episodes, what I learn in theory probably is going to pale into insignificance compared to the experience.
It's very true. And you know, you have to make compromises. Eventually you've got to jump one way, you know. It's like I always compare it to going on a holiday. So you've got, you know, a week to go to Italy, say, and you can't do the whole of Italy in a week, so you've got to decide which bits you're going to do. So you eventually say, well, we'll do Venice and Rome and Florence, but you'll miss Siena and Bologna and Naples and all the other good things. And you end up thinking, at the end of the holiday, you think, well, I've just scraped the surface. There's much more of Italy I actually want to go and see, you know. And it must be like that with self-building. You can't do everything. You've got to make some choices. You've got to jump one way. And it ends up, an awful lot of it comes down to people. You meet people you like, you get on with them, they make sense, you click, and you're guided by them, you know. And whether that is actually the best thing to do or not is impossible to know, really. But it's like all businesses, it's a people business, and very often the connections are made at shows, or, you know, you meet people or friends that have done it, and this sort of subtle thing going on that decides what people use and what people don't use. One of the really interesting examples is green oak. We've seen a huge growth in green oak building in the last 10 years. In the 1990s, hardly any, there was border oak was around, and that was Carpenter oak and woodland were around, but it was a tiny little level, and now it's exploded to a big proportion of, I don't know what the percentage is, 10-15% of self-builders using green oak, which isn't cheap. There's no functional point in it at all. It just is good looking, and people love it because it's both rooted in history of building oak framed houses that the Tudors did, but it also gives you a modern open plan structure which people love because they've got big glass and open plan living, and so it ticks lots of boxes, and it's come from nowhere to become a really dominant thread in the self-build scene, and quite wise. Hard to put your finger on it. It's just people visiting these houses and thinking that looks good, and it's filtered through to the level where it's a major component of self-build. So things like that are really, it's to do with fashion, and it's passed on from friends. Other things people have tried that have never caught on. You think, well, why didn't it?
Let's just move on now to the main topic of today's podcast. And I always like asking people what they would like to focus on, because I feel that we'll get a better interview that way. And you mentioned this, that you'd really like to compare what we're doing in the UK with what's going on in Germany. So perhaps first you could say why you've chosen to compare these two countries and their building attitudes.
Well, I've been behind the scenes. I've been quite involved in trying to promote self-build as a sector, working with Ted Stevens and NASBA to help promote the cause of self-build with the government. And our previous housing minister, Grant Shapps, has been very supportive of it and has been working on getting self-build accepted in the planning documents so that local authorities have to at least acknowledge it, whereas up till now it just bypassed them. And you can't really get involved with looking at self-build for long without seeing, well, what goes on in other countries. And it becomes very apparent very quickly that Britain has a very unusual housing market. We have tiny levels of self-build, something like 10 to 15%, whereas a lot of our neighbours on the continent, over half the housing is self-built. It's so common, in fact, that they don't refer to it as being self-built. It's just how they build houses. In Germany, something like 60% of the new housing is what we would call self-built. They'll call it custom building. And the German house building model just is far superior to what we do. For a start, they build over twice as many houses as we do. So there are actually more self-builds in Germany every year than we manage our entire housing output, And then we are being exhorted by ministers and various lobby groups to, we're in a housing crisis, we've got to build more housing. And in Germany it just happens, and it all happens by custom building. And you think, well, why has it happened that way? And what's different about their building culture that's developed down a completely different route? And I've been doing some research on that, talking to various people. Been to Germany 2 or 3 times to look at it. And there's a very interesting guy in Cambridge who's an academic here who's also helping me out on looking at the reasons behind it. And it seems to come down almost to a cultural thing. We've sort of looked at the planning systems and how they develop and how land in Germany gets bought for self-build, whereas in Britain it gets snapped up by big developers. And what seems to be we're facing in Britain is that we have the same issues, that people want land to build on. But in Britain we have a system where the landowner and their agent, which is usually a house builder, promotes schemes and comes forward to the council to say, can we build on this land? And the council sits there and arbitrates about it and says yay or nay. And if they do, then they try and claw back as much as they can in tax from the deal. So the uplift, you get this huge uplift in value between agricultural land, which is worth a few £1,000s an acre. Suddenly you draw a line on the map and it's house building and it's worth £1 million an acre. There's a huge, like a windfall profit. So any farmer out there who can turn a field into a building plot effectively wins the lottery. That has a couple of effects. One is it sets neighbour against neighbour. If you're in a village where the farmer's trying to, and I know this from personal experience, the farmer's always trying to get permission on a field, and all the rest of the village becomes terribly antagonised by it and sets themselves against this greedy guy. He's already got 5 Range Rovers. What does he want with that field? And all that sort of thing. And this is where the NIMBY thing comes from. It's as much about envy and the politics of envy. Why should this guy benefit from it? It's the village land. What happens in Germany is completely different. The land is identified for building, and the council comes forward and says, before planning permission is ever applied for, says, we've identified this as a potential building plot. We'd like to buy it off you. It's almost like a system of compulsory purchase. The landowner's persuaded to, they get a small premium for losing the field, and the council goes in and just decides to build service plots and decides we're going to sell it to locals. If anyone with a local connection can come along and buy this. If they haven't, then we'll sell it. But the whole emphasis is changed in somehow the land speculation just goes out of it. And so they've built up an industry where people will come along. Say if you wanted to move to a small town in England, for instance, say you got a job in Bury St Edmunds, for instance, you'd go there and you'd either buy on the second-hand market or you'd go around and all the new housing would be built in estates around the edge of town, and there'd be a flagpole. You'd go and see the show house and maybe go down and try and negotiate a deal with the developer. In Germany, an equivalent move, you'd go to the town and there'd be service plots sitting there, ready waiting for you. And instead of going to a developer, you go off to a show house village and you can visit, I think there's 150 custom home builders in Germany, something like that. Family businesses turning out a few hundred houses a year each, and they'll all have show houses. You go to the show house and decide which house you want. They'll have a range of plots, or maybe you've got the plot already lined up, and you negotiate the deal. So you end up basically with the customer in control. They're going in there rather than having a choice of, maybe 2 building plots, which have been done by spec builders around Bury St Edmunds. You've got a choice of 100, 150 different house builders. Much more like buying a kitchen or a car. You can go in and you can decide what you want, and then the house is built for you over a period of sort of 3-4 months. And you go in and you've ended up with a housing system that not only works with the consumer, whereas ours sort of works against it, but it's a much higher standard, because instead of, if you've only got one site around a town, it doesn't really matter what the building standards are, because you either buy it or you don't. They're not actually competing on building standards. So the German building standards are inherently higher than ours, just because the factory builders are competing with one another. And you get more choice, because you can go in and you can choose what you want. Typically the contract is signed completely on the dotted line before they even start building, so you even know what tiles are going on the walls and what the door handles are going to look like. So the whole system is like turned around on its head. Now the question I was asking is really, why is it developed so different? It's like chalk and cheese, the 2 different ways of doing house building. How have we got the situation where we have a product that's built by spec builders that no one particularly likes? Most people in Britain would not choose to build a house from a spec builder if they had, if they could get something else. The houses are mean. They're the smallest houses in Europe. They've got less and less garden. An awful lot of new housing has no garden at all. And generally, and it's also done over the dead bodies of the community around. They think, wait, we really hate this estate. We hate this whole process. In Germany, they don't have this sort of NIMBY factor going on, because they're working with the grain of the community. So it's a big ask, but it's an interesting observation, isn't it?
Quite interesting. As you were saying that, I was thinking of my own particular situation, maybe 500 metres down the road, where they have done exactly that in our local town. And I've only lived in Hertford for 8 or 9 years, and I have noticed the change in how it feels. And this I find fascinating, how it can feel different in that time. But a lot of it I put down to 2,000 new homes coming in quite a short space of time, and not having any input, as you say. You feel we're powerless. We've just got to accept that. And quite often I think to myself, I wouldn't want to live in these homes. So if I don't want to live in these homes, I'm sure the people who are in this lovely historic town, we all have certain standards. Yeah. And I understand we need affordable housing, but you can see the conflict here.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. And I don't think there's anything actually in our planning rules that prohibit us from doing what the Germans do. It's hard to put your finger on it. This guy Marcus, who was doing this, I'm working with in Cambridge, was saying that the house he bought is a 1930s house, not far from here actually, and he was looking at the assessment on how it was built and who the first owners were. And he worked out, well, actually, in the 1930s, the street was actually laid out by the council and the plots were divided by the council, and a lot of it was self-built or done by very small local developers. Not so different to what happens in Germany today. So somehow we've gone from that sort of system that wasn't so very different to one that's globlets of land being released in big blocks and deals done before, in deals between sort of farmers and builders and planners about, what will happen to this. And the little people never even go to looking on it. It's just the whole thing's decided at a level which is completely undemocratic and isn't accountable to the local community. Not surprising, it's not popular. Neither the product nor the process is popular. And it's, as I say, I can't really put my finger on it, but somehow something's happened in our house building industry in the last 30, 40 years that's just pushed it down that way. And the council's become a box ticker tax collector, but they're not actually going in and they're not interested at all in the development process. They're just interested in how many units they're going to be there, and are there enough roads and are there enough schools and that sort of thing. They don't go in and enable the process and take any active part in it.
How damaging do you feel this is, or is it just a difference?
Well, I mean, there are some pluses to it. What we do have in the UK, we get much denser housing, which ticks some sustainability boxes. I mean, if you go to Germany, you don't even need to go to Germany. You can do it from Google Earth. You can hone in on the suburb of a German town or village, and you can immediately see the different layout patterns. It's much looser, more organic, and the houses they're bigger for a start. They have much bigger gardens, and so it eats up more land. Now that's an issue in the southeast of England because people want to keep density and they want to build on brownfield sites and they want to cram it all in. But there's two sides to this coin, aren't there? And you'll probably find in your town, most of that new development is crammed in on tiny bits of land, and you get very, very pokey houses with tiny gardens, nowhere to park the car, and it's all done in how many minutes it is from the station, that sort of thing.
I'm noticing something else, that because we perhaps have this limit on land or we can't access it at the moment, we're swallowing up gardens.
Yeah.
Quite often you'll find, we'll build at the end of our garden and then move into that and sell the other property. And I feel this loss of vegetation or space, it's counterproductive.
It is, and we've become, because of the NIMBY factory, we've become, as a nation, very anti-development. We don't like to see our green fields go. We don't like to see our gardens go. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that a house with a big garden has much more biodiversity in it than a field that it might have replaced. But we don't think of it positively like that. I mean, we just think of the whole thing going under concrete. And the whole thing we just think of negatively. The same thing goes on with the big wind farm debates. In the typical English countryside, all the villages, almost 99% of them are against wind farms on their patch. Germany has, again, a completely different system. Is that a lot of have a wind farm, that the profits from it will go to the village, or be shared with the village and the people putting the scheme forward. Consequently, they're keen to have wind farms because they can actually see, there's money coming in, and it's all this comes down really to one's attitude to land. Whether it's we always have this paradox, the fact that land is nominally privately owned, but what you can do on it is controlled by the council, sometimes by the state, and effectively by your neighbours. Your neighbour has a say-so over what you can and can't do over your land. So you've got this sort of funny position where it sort of sits. It's not quite a free market, and it's not quite state-controlled. And in Britain, we seem to have developed a line that, because we're more given to sort of free market solutions, we are less likely to interfere in the land. But paradoxically, we ended up with all the deals being done with big landowners and developers, and the little guys getting cut out of the system. Whereas the Germans have been far more interventionist and have ended up with a freer market, with much more a better functioning market. They don't have the huge boom and bust that we've had in our housing market. They build better homes, bigger homes. They seem to satisfy what people want. And there's not this big debate about, oh my God, we haven't got enough self-build, because they just don't really have spec. There's spec build in Germany goes on in flats in cities, where obviously you need a enabling developer to build a block of flats. But almost everything out in the small towns and the countryside is just done by individuals working with all these house building companies.
Is there a difference in community as well? Is that an aspect that you've looked at?
Well, it's a very interesting point that, again, Marcus said to me. He comes from Bavaria, and his parents have self-built, his sister's self-built. He'd love to do it around Cambridge, but there's no land around Cambridge. You either move out 10 miles out of town, or you try and negotiate something on one of the sites coming. And then there's a huge amount of building in this town, as you can imagine, but almost nothing's been set aside for self-build. But he said, for instance, if you apply for a planning permission in Germany, in the UK, the council sends something in the post to all your neighbours and that allows you to object to the council. In Germany, you're expected to go around and meet your neighbours and knock on their door and show them your plans. Hello, I'm Heinrich. I've just bought this plot. This is the house I intend to build. I hope you don't mind. And you go and you sit and you have a schnapps with your neighbour. You actually work your own. So you know them all with your planning permission. So it is a completely different attitude to land ownership, isn't it?
Okay, here's something that I've just thought of. Is it just inherent in their nature? They're efficient in their lifestyle, really, aren't they? Well,
the Germans do have, obviously, a well-earned reputation for being efficient and being wonderful engineers, and that goes in their building trade. It goes without saying that their building standards are just generally higher than ours. But I don't think this is to do. This is actually to do with on the grain of how they operate the society. And I suspect this goes on in Holland and Scandinavia and maybe not so much in France, but a lot of the other countries, they're just more geared into working with the community, with the neighbours, rather than our system, which we've sort of set up. It's just become adversarial. You know, we're used to adversarial battles and planning battles and this sort of battle, and it's just the way that the British culture works. So it would also be very difficult for us to sort of suddenly say, well, let's be like Germany, because we've got huge vested interests in our development community, and all the big house builders live and breathe these deals, and the way, and we don't have a big factory house building industry in this country. We've got a few timber frame builders who do very well, like the oak framers being a good example, but they don't do the whole house. They just really do the superstructure. They leave you to finish it off yourself, and you couldn't use, it would be like turning around a super tanker. I reckon the difference has been growing over the decades. We couldn't suddenly say, right, we'll be like Germany, we'll have much more self-build on this model, because the industry doesn't exist, and it would take years of, much more conciliatory planning for the confidence to build up for these businesses. There's no reason in theory why we couldn't do it, but in practice it would take a long time to turn it around. So we had a more continental-style house building business here in this country.
Are there any lessons to conclude on here?
Well, for a lot of us in the UK building industry, there's a lot of envy. The fact that a lot of things that, if you go right back to the sort of 90s, you get people like Egan talking about how we should introduce factory building, and it's much more efficient and it's better and you get away with all this. And it's hard to argue with them, but what we've lacked is this sort of ability to translate that to buildings on the ground. In the UK, it's fringe. There's more of it in self-build than there is in mainstream building. But even so, it's difficult because you do for instance, if you do a timber frame factory, it's a huge capital investment that you're putting into it. You want to be confident that you're going to have an output going on year after year after year. Well, in our boom and bust business, the way our housing market operates, you can't really be reliant on that. You might have 5 good years and suddenly your orders dry up and you've gone out of business. And we see that time and again. And I suppose the German model is much more stable, and they know that if they build a factory house business, they're going to have the business in 20, 30 years' time, and then they can think about exporting, and it's a much, much stronger base for them to work from. If there's a lesson for us, basically the councils have to stop being frightened of the way the system is at the moment and become much more interventionist. We do have some councils which are taking on board the idea that land should be retained for self-builders. We like what's happening in Shropshire, we call the Shropshire model, where they're even including self-build in their affordable housing quotas, so they can actually bring forward schemes that they know developers aren't going to get into. But it's going to be a long, slow process. It's going to be many years. And I do worry that when the government sort of sees this chart of how little self-build there is in the UK, they don't see the reverse of it, which is how much spec build there is. And in order to increase the amount of self-build, we've got to decrease the amount of spec build. And the spec builders have long arms in deep pockets, and they're very effective lobbyists, and it's hard to see them giving up their grip on the system as it now exists. So I think we will see a growing market for self-build in the UK, but it's going to be a long, slow haul. It's not going to happen overnight.
Well, Mark, thank you very much for introducing this discussion and telling us a little bit about it. And for everyone else, the House Builders Bible is up to the 10th edition, is that right?
Coming out shortly, yeah. It'll be a red cover for the first time. I've always had an orange cover up to now, because I originally thought it was going to be like the yellow pages, but we've gone red this year. So do watch out for it, and hopefully I'll be keeping on top of events and changes in years to come.
And we'll also link to your blog in the show notes. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Another industry expert on houseplanninghelp.com.
I really like these sessions when we open it to the wider discussion as well, because I feel that somehow I can learn something. Hopefully you're enjoying it too, and it's still relevant to you and your house building experience. But I just like these wider debates. So we'll put an affiliate link to the House Builders Bible in the show notes. If you don't know what an affiliate link is, because I probably haven't mentioned that before, but it means that if you click on it and go and buy your book through that link, I get a very small commission. It's only a few pennies and you don't pay any more, but I would really appreciate that support. It's tough work sometimes keeping this blog going, and as I say, I want to grow it, and so I need more money somehow to do that. So your help if you use that link. Don't use it if you don't want to, but if you are getting that book in the 10th edition, then I'd appreciate it if you went through that link. In fact, I have been thinking of other ways that I can try and generate a bit more cash for this podcast. And one thing that I might be looking at in the future is to get a sponsor of the podcast. There's another idea I've got is writing an ebook of some of my learning, just trying to keep it to the simple things, because sometimes there can be too much information, but I think that could be beneficial too. But what I might do first is a survey to see if you're interested and if you might want some of the things that I've picked up, because I can only put so much of it into the podcast and onto the website, and quite often on the website all the information may be there, but it's difficult to filter through. So putting it into a new format that's easy to read, that could be one of the ideas for the future, but just letting you know at this stage. So next time on the podcast from houseplanninghelp.com, I get an introduction to ventilation, obviously very important in houses. But Andy Simmons from Simmons Mills Architects is my guest. He's also the chief executive of the AECB, which is a great organisation. I know I've mentioned them before, and I will mention them many times again. So that's me signing off. I hope you can join me next time.
You've been listening to Ben Adam Smith on the path to build a better home. Sign up now to the free email newsletter. Head to houseplanninghelp.com.